Is it a problem that the First Amendment hamstrings the government when it tries to censor speech? That was the question asked by liberal-leaning Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson during oral arguments yesterday for Murphy v. Missouri, the case that will decide whether the Biden administration can pressure social media companies to remove content. Let's take a listen.
Justice Jackson?
So my biggest concern is that your view has the First Amendment hamstringing the government in significant ways in the most important time periods. What would you have the government do? I've heard you say a couple times that the government can post its own speech, but in my hypothetical, kids, this is not safe, don't do it, is not going to get it done. And so I guess some might say that the government actually has a duty to take steps to protect the citizens of this country.
Conservative Justice Samuel Alito, on the other hand, had this to say.
I cannot imagine federal officials taking that approach to the print media, our representatives over there. If you did that to them, what do you think the reaction would be? And so I thought, the only reason why this is taking place is because the federal government has got Section 230 and antitrust in its pocket.
Here to weigh in on this case is journalist Matt Taibbi, whose reporting has helped expose the efforts undertaken by federal officials to exert influence over content moderation. Welcome to Rising, Matt.
Thanks for having me on, Robbie, Brianna.
Great to have you back with us. Obviously, this is an issue we've talked about a lot on this show, that we followed closely, your work and work by others, to bring to light what the federal government did to try to control the narrative on social media. So finally, we're at the stage where the case is being heard by the Supreme Court. And I think the impression from a lot of people, of our thinking, who hope that the Supreme Court will put some limits on federal officials trying to exert this censorship effort over the companies. I think we were a little concerned that the justices seem to be wary. We heard there from Ketanji Brown Jackson, but she was not alone in being wary of holding back or kneecapping or preventing the federal government from being able to communicate with social media companies in this way. What were your impressions of what you heard yesterday?
Well, first of all, that clip by Ketanji Brown Jackson, that was kind of terrifying, because the entire purpose of the First Amendment is to restrain the government. It's not to restrain the public from getting in the way of government action. It's the opposite. If it restrains the government, that's a good thing. That's sort of the idea behind the statute. In this instance, the reason this suit is being filed is because the plaintiffs in this case, in particular, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff, and Dr. Aaron Hariati, they had their speech suppressed because they were contradicting a false government official opinion. And this is the entire purpose of the First Amendment, is to prevent the government from creating a hegemonic opinion that cannot be challenged. That is why we have a free press. And that was the essence of this case. And the government was allowed to argue the opposite.
Matt, devil's advocate here, I'm very sympathetic to the argument that Twitter's actions in response to the government pressure were censorship and were wrong. But it does seem to me that there's a separate question here, which is whether or not the bad actor here, or the but-for clause here, is really the government's actions, or the company's choice to kind of succumb to that sort of soft pressure. There did seem to be a lot of discussion of this case, National Rifle Association versus Volo, and it did seem that most of the judges, including the liberal judges, but not exclusive to them, were making the case that case featured direct coercion from the government of a business that's saying that they were going to blacklist a business if they did not censor or reject the NRA. In this case, I know here on the show we talk about the kind of soft pressure and the possibility of threatening social media companies with Section 230 rule changes that could basically end the ability of a lot of these businesses to function and the like. But I'm wondering if in this case and in these oral arguments, that kind of more direct pressure was raised, or is the question really whether the government is allowed to flack, if the government is allowed to reach out and make its preferences known to a social media company, as long as a social media company has the power that something and isn't feeling I think, really directly coerced with real threats of some damage, pecuniary or otherwise, happening to their business if they don't comply with the government's requests?
Well, Brianna, I mean, that's a good question, but there were so many instances of the government making that overt threat that you refer to that the Deputy Associate Solicitor General, Brian Fletcher, had to list them in advance, essentially introducing them as sort of adverse evidence at the beginning of the case in order to downplay their seriousness. In the summer of 2021, the president himself, Joe Biden, said that Section 230 needs to be immediately revoked because the companies are promoting falsehoods. There was the same thing was said by the White House press secretary, Kate Bedingfield. The Surgeon General said something very similar, that we need to take appropriate regulatory measures in response to this kind of misinformation. Renee DiResta, who is the research director of the Election Integrity Project, which was sponsored by both the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security, talked about using Section 230 to bring these companies to heel. This was an overt threat. And also, I would add, in the Twitter files, we found ample evidence of correspondence among Twitter's executives in which they described how they understood the regulatory changes that were being proposed as a threat that they must answer in order to get the government off their back. They would have to comply with the government's request to let them in on the moderation process. So we saw that in the internal correspondence. So there's both overt and less obvious evidence of this. That's not missing from the case. That's a feature of the case. In fact, the government going public with those threats, I think, was sending a very strong message that not only the companies would hear it, but that the public would hear it. So I disagree with the notion that they didn't make that overt case, even though Fletcher said that.
And can I just make a quick follow-up to that? Do you have a sense that there could be a way to distinguish between, let's call it more soft pressure, the government saying, hey, I'd prefer that you don't let this fake post of a family member of a president stay up on Twitter, that request can be acceded to or denied, versus the kind of regulatory threats that were coming from the president? Do you think it's worthwhile to make that distinction, or do you think that both kinds of government contact with these kinds of companies should be precluded?
Well, let's just talk about what did happen, right? The analogy, and the justices compared it to what would happen with, say, the Associated Press or the New York Times. The analogous conduct would be calling up the editor-in-chief or the publisher of the New York Times, or let's just say a local television station, and saying, we're going to pull your FCC license unless you do X, Y, or Z, or unless you hold this story. That would be such an inappropriate call that the person who even answered that call on the press end would be in serious ethical problems, I would say. But they didn't just do that. In this case, they went straight to the heads of the company, but they also had an industrial scale operation to do this. It wasn't just occasionally, hey, let's make a phone call and make our feelings known. They had a sort of private highway to all of these companies where they were funneling mass requests. Now, what I would say would be okay and is appropriate, in fact, even desirable, is if the president gets up and uses the bully pulpit and says, you know what, I don't like what's on Facebook. They made a mistake here, here, and here. Here's what I think the truth is. And, we see these posts that say something else. That is the entire purpose of the bully pulpit. The president has an enormous megaphone to counter that kind of thing. What's not appropriate is doing it in private and coupling it with a threat. That's what happened in this case.
Yeah, I've been looking at the case law for, job owning is the legal term here, where the government tries to extort a private actor to do something that they couldn't get through a legislative remedy, or haven't tried to get through a legislative remedy. There are cases of, I think, phone companies having dealt with. There are some examples of the past, but it's not been a well-developed or well-fleshed out category of law. So look, it's an open question, obviously, because they're litigating it now, whether this contact was not just inappropriate, but unconstitutional. And if the Supreme Court ends up saying, as unfortunately looked like it might be the case based on their line of questioning yesterday, that, look, this might be, you might view this contact as inappropriate, but it doesn't actually violate the Constitution, then the question, I guess, becomes there could still be a legislative remedy. Congress could pass a law that precludes government employees of at least federal agencies. I think actually maybe they can't do anything about, members of Congress have very wide latitude according to the Constitution, but they could, similar to, the Hatch Act says you can't campaign on federal time or money if you're a federal employee. We could structure some policy for how federal employees are supposed to interact with social media companies or just the media in general. Do you think that's the direction? I hate to look to Congress for a remedy, but is that the direction we'll have to turn if the Supreme Court does not take up this question? Or doesn't give us the answer I want, I guess.
I think it's going to be difficult, absent a judicial ruling that this kind of behavior is illegal. I would argue that it's already illegal. I mean, some of these agencies that were engaged in this kind of behavior by statute are prohibited from engaging in domestic propaganda, let alone censorship. So the idea that the State Department is doing this, or for instance, the CIA, which was participating in some of these programs, or FBI counterintelligence agents, the Foreign Influence Task Force, going after domestic speech, I think that's already against the law, but we need an affirmative high court ruling that says that in order to make it possible, I think, to make the legislative changes that we would want, or that I would want anyway. The problem is the enforcement mechanism is absent here. And incidentally, just to go back to the whole issue of threats and what is and is not allowed, the appellate courts that heard this case, and I was at the Louisiana hearing when there was a colloquy between the government and three appellate judges who they were very, very well versed in the case. They had read all the evidence, all the exhibits. They were clearly not happy about quite a lot of things, but they delineated a 4-part test that came from some lower court case. Brianna, maybe you can tell me what it is. I forget, but one of the standards was if the communications are phrased virtually as orders. And we saw that repeatedly in communications, both in the Twitter files and in the evidence that came into the complaint in Missouri v. Biden, which is now Murphy v. Missouri. The government would not be taking this tone with these companies if they did not have leverage over them. As you know, we've all been reporters. We've all been in the situation of having a government spokesperson sort of beg or plead, please don't write this or that, or I think you're making a mistake if you publish this. And they do so politely because they don't have any leverage to tell me what to do. I'm a member of the Fourth Estate. I have my own independence, and they don't have a right to tell me not to do it. Well, the tone is very, very different in these communications between, say, the FBI and these companies. There are letters that say things like, hey, we wrote you 6 hours ago. How come no action has been taken? Like, you would never get that just as a journalist. That is a completely different kind. Would you?
Matt, I got to say, I got some very impolite flack once from Chuck Schumer's office back in my Intercept days, but that's neither here nor there.
Well, they can be rude, but they wouldn't have an expectation that you would comply.
But no, but
I hear you that there's something different in tone.
But this is the problem. I mean, I do think this order language, or whether you're talking about the NRA case, that's really the crucial thing. And while I agree with you and Robbie about what I think the constructive outcome should be, I find myself on the fence about whether or not this is the right mechanism to enforce it. I think some of the statutory mechanisms that you raised before about what limits the government should impose statutorily on its ability to liaise with some of these companies seems right. But in this case, the way that this is being written up, and I admit that I have not read all of the briefing here, they say that they did not raise actually any of these kinds of orders or directives from the government in the case. I'm reading a write-up, a summary in Vox, where the strongest argument made is that the government, quote, entangled themselves in the platform's decision-making process, which I can agree is a problem and maybe should be remedied through some of these statutory means. But has there been a strong enough argument made? I think this is the question. Has there been a strong enough argument made that the kinds of emails that you have covered so well in the Twitter files really did constitute an order? Or did the plaintiffs here properly bring in and make the case that statements by the president or others about Section 230 were sufficiently coercive? Was that case made? Because I think that's a much stronger case than even plentiful emails, even nagging emails, even voluminous emails saying we don't like X, Y, and Z policy. I'm having trouble differentiating that from the kind of flacking that we know all exists in the realm of the media, traditional media.
Yeah. Again, it's so different from what goes on in traditional media. I mean, we did several Twitter file stories about, for instance, an episode in early 2017 where the Senate Intelligence Committee was not happy that the companies were stonewalling them on turning over evidence pertaining to possible Russian bot activity, or what evidence they did turn up they didn't like. And so right after those communications, hey, we need to see all this data, which they weren't entitled to, by the way. They asked for them. Immediately after that, they introduced legislation that would dramatically impact their ability to collect ad revenue from certain foreign customers. And so we see this back and forth within Twitter. Hey, we better do what they say and let them into this process of looking at our data on, Russians and all these other things, or else it's going to lower our bottom line. We are going to lose money. We're going to lose ad revenue. And they ended up proactively making a decision to forego that activity so that they wouldn't go ahead and pass that law. There was a similar episode where they were dragged to the Hill in order to come up with a plan for preventing the sowing of discord. This was presented to them sort of side by side with a big white paper that had been written by Senator Mark Warner, essentially listing a whole series of regulatory measures involving everything from Section 230 to the taxation of big tech companies. And, as the lower court judges said, you have to be sort of an idiot not to see what they were saying. It was like, a mob movie. Two judges compared it to a mob movie. They said, hey, it's a nice tech company you got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. And they, the companies certainly understood it that way. We see that from their internal correspondence. Now, the one thing I will agree with you on is that this case was not perfect in the sense that they didn't show a soup to nuts progression involving any one of the particular plaintiffs where the person was censored, and we know that they were censored because of a particular communication from the government. You can see the government saying, for instance, we don't want anybody who is creating content that would promote vaccine hesitancy. And we see that shortly afterwards, people like Dr. Bhattacharya or Dr. Kuldorf were de-amplified or removed from platforms. But that's not a direct causal relationship that they've been able to establish. And I think that was the weakest part of the case. However, I think the activity itself was plainly illegal, but the problem is one of standing rather than legality.
Very interesting, Matt. Great discussion. Thanks for helping us think through this case. We really appreciate it.
Great to sit with you both. Take care.